Hello, Haunted Family. Welcome back. Story 1. Bedroom Visitor. I had an experience with a nightly visitor that happened to me over 18 years ago, and I'm still trying to figure out if it was real or not. I was 10 years old at the time, and I was living with my mom, my little sister, and my stepdad in a small town in Illinois. My mother used to work the afternoon shift, 3 to 11 at a hospital. And I always wanted to wait up for her, even though she wouldn't arrive home until after midnight. On one of these particular nights, my stepdad allowed me to wait up for her. I tried everything I knew to help me keep my eyes open. Nothing worked. The next thing I knew, my stepdad was lifting me off the couch and carrying me to my bedroom. On the way down the hallway, I pleaded with him to let me stay up so I could see her. But he reminded me that I had school the next morning, and I needed to sleep. He laid me down on my bed and covered me up, and then he went over to my sister and put the cover back on her and left the room. He closed the door behind him. I was mad at first, but I quickly settled in and drifted back off to sleep. I've always been a light sleeper. Any amount of noise and I would come completely out of my sleep. My eyes flew open, and I thought I heard the front door slam. At this time we lived in a very small 2-bedroom apartment, and any amount of noise was easily heard throughout the entire place. The walls were so thin. If you put your ear to the wall, you could hear entire conversations of the people who lived downstairs. Well, like I said, I heard the front door close, and I thought it was my mom. I started to get out of bed when I looked up at the door to my room, and there was someone standing in the corner. This took me completely off guard. I started to wonder why there was someone in my room just standing in the corner watching me sleep. And then I started to look at it. The room was completely dark, but this thing was darker than the blackness. It was very tall, and it just started to sway back and forth, back and forth. The weirdest thing about it was that it was strange, reflective, cat-like eyes. You know when you shine a light into a cat's eyes and they start to shine? That's exactly how these looked. And I was starting to get really scared. I laid back down in my bed, and I just stared at it. I watched it walk from the corner over to my sister's bed. It had bent over and picked something up off her bed, walked over to the foot of my bed, and stood there for a little while. Then it walked back to the corner of the room by the door. I was too scared to leave the room, and it was standing by the door, the only exit. I didn't want it to touch me. I didn't want it to grab me. So I yelled out for my mom and my stepdad. It seemed like I was screaming at the top of my lungs, but no one came. It was like they couldn't hear me. Then it occurred to me that my sister didn't budge while I was yelling. It was like she was in a very deep sleep, and I was paralyzed by fear. I couldn't shake her awake. And then I started calling her name. The shadow walked over to her bed and stood right beside her. It bent and kissed her on the cheek. Finally, my screams seemed to break through to her, and she started to stir a little and finally came out of her sleep. I whispered to her, "Do you see someone standing beside your bed?" She looked puzzled. She got up on her elbows and looked about the room. "What are you talking about? I don't see anything. Stop all that screaming and go back to sleep." "You don't see anything? There's something in the room. It just kissed you on the cheek." She threw her covers back over her head. She refused to hear what I had to say. She just pleaded with me to shut up and to go back to sleep. And I pleaded with her to go get our mom. She didn't want to hear it. I then decided I needed to talk to it. I asked it all sorts of questions, but it never answered me. Since it wouldn't communicate with me, I told it to leave my room, and it just stood there swaying back and forth with those glowing eyes. I gave up on my sister. She thought I was crazy, so I just laid there in my bed and stared at it until I dozed off. As soon as I woke up in the morning, I couldn't believe what I saw. Everything in my room had disappeared, even my sister. And when I say everything, I mean it looked like we had been robbed. I bolted out of my room and ran down the hall. Ran into my mom's bedroom. Or, I tried to, at least. The door was locked. They never lock their door. I banged on her door and screamed and screamed. She finally came to the door and she calmed me down. And she explained that we couldn't have been robbed. The front door was bolted shut from the inside. And I told her, forget that. Come and look at my bedroom. I grabbed her by the hand and pulled her behind me. And just like that, everything was back the way it should be. And my sister was sitting in her bed, looking very frightened. At the moment, I thought I was losing my mind. I know what I saw. My sister proceeded to tell our mom about how I was scaring her and talking about a man being in our room. My mother scolded me for making up stories and frightening my sister, but I insisted that it was all true. The events of that night bothered me to this day, and my mother and sister still talk about that night sometimes. They always ask me what happened, and my story never changes. Something was in that room, and I'm sure of it. Story 2. The Evil Dresser. This all started when the lady across the street died, and we got a large dresser with a mirror. I was young, maybe 3 or 4 years old. My mom started noticing things first. She was the first person to start hearing weird noises. One night, before my youngest sister was born, I decided I was going to sleep with my parents that night. I don't know why. I guess I must have been scared of something. I was asleep, and it was around midnight. All the windows were shut, and my mom just sits up in bed. She could hear a voice. It sounded like a little girl singing. It wasn't me. I was sound asleep. And I was the only child in the house. The song continued on. And as soon as my mom started to get out of bed and the bed creaked, the sound vanished. A few years later, we were moved, and my youngest sister was born. The dresser was put into storage under the house. Nothing happened. We moved again and began using the dresser again. And it came back. We started hearing doors slammed, a whistling sound, and the distinct sounds of footsteps in the hallway. My youngest sister could hear her name being called. One night I woke up and went screaming down the hall to my mom's room. I told her that there was a little girl in the mirror that was attached to that dresser. I was too short to even see my own reflection in the mirror, so it wasn't mine. I was so afraid that I would not go back into my room. My mom went in front of the dresser, and she told it, whatever it was, to stop it. But it didn't listen. Whatever or whoever it was seemed to like my sister in particular. She started to hear her name being called even when we was not in the house. And some nights her bed would get bouncy, as she liked to call it. But in reality, the mattress was jumping sometimes 6 inches off the bed. and sometimes the bed itself was shaking violently. On one occasion, my mom even saw what she thought was the spirit of whatever little girl was causing this. She said she looked to be about 10 years old, with long brown braids pinned up on top of her head. And it continues to this day. Story 3. She kept me company. I bought a used trailer in the summer of '93. The trailer had been completely redone. The outside was not beat up in any way, so I kind of wondered what the inside looked like. I moved in at the end of October 1993. Being single, I was the only one there, and I could feel a presence here, but I wasn't afraid of it in any way. A few months later, I became sick. I didn't get out of bed for 2 whole days. On the second night I was laying in bed, I felt the covers being pulled around me, as if there was someone tucking me in. I also felt the breath of whoever it was. I wasn't on any medication. I didn't have a fever. I wasn't dreaming in any way. A short time later, I felt the bed sag, as it would if someone was sitting on the edge of it. But there was no one there. 2 of my cousins have seen the same little girl that I've seen standing in the hallway looking into the living room. She's about 8 years old, maybe a little older, with dark hair that goes down to the middle of her back. She's wearing a light blue dress that has small flowers on it. She has a really long white ribbon in her hair. She seems to be looking at us, but she's not frowning or smiling or really any distinguishable facial expression. I've also noticed that anytime I take pictures while sitting on the couch or anywhere around the couch, day or night, there's a white mist or cloud in every picture. I can't figure it out. I've married now, and I have 3 stepchildren, and them being around seems to have helped out a bit. My ghost does not come around nearly as often as she did before. I've never felt any danger or harm from her. Just company and companionship, knowing that I was not alone. Story 4. The Crying Baby. My experience happened when I was not even 2. My parents experienced it and told me a couple of years ago. We had moved into a townhome that had recently been renovated. And by renovated, I mean there had been a fire, and the house had basically been stripped down to the studs and redone. We had moved in, and about a week later, my parents heard a baby crying, and then footsteps coming from the stair area. There was a bathroom near the stairs, and when my parents would go to investigate the baby crying, the water in the toilet would be running, as if someone had recently flushed it. But who? It was just them and little baby me in the house. The baby crying was the most annoying of things. They would come running into my room thinking it was me, and I would be sound asleep. They didn't have neighbors that had babies. The noise was coming from inside their apartment. My parents, they swore it was coming from the stair area. And a couple weeks later, they decided that it was time to move out. The place was just too spooky for us. And they found out that a family of 4, 2 parents, a toddler, and an infant, had been found under the stairs when the house had burned. They had become trapped, and they had died. I guess that's the baby they heard. And probably the frantic footsteps on the stairs. I particularly enjoyed Story 2, The Evil Dresser. As you know, I live in Kentucky, and Kentucky has its own haunted dresser that's semi-famous. In 1976, the Kentucky Historical Society came into possession what is called the Conjured Chest. that is said to be responsible for, I want to say, 18 deaths since it was built. The chest was also on a Travel Channel special titled Deadly Possessions. The story basically goes that a man named Jeremiah Graham was getting things ready for the birth of his firstborn child. And he ordered someone that he had enslaved to make a dresser for this child's birth. And the man, Remus, made the dresser. And it is absolutely gorgeous. But Mr. Graham was not happy with the way the chest looked and beat Remus to death. In retaliation, the other enslaved people on his farm, I don't know how else to put this, worked some magic. They sprinkled some dried owl's blood and did some other things and said to have cursed the chest. The chest was then moved into the child's nursery and the child died in infancy. That is the first death associated with the chest, not counting the chest's maker. Then Mr. Graham's twin brother had a son. That son's clothes was put in the chest of drawers, and that son was stabbed to death on his 21st birthday. Another man, John Ryan, immigrated from Ireland, eloped with Catherine Winchell. Mr. Graham arranged for them to live on land belonging to the Grahams, gave them the chest of drawers. They both used it. And they both had untimely deaths. And that was the pattern that kept going for many, many years. If someone's belongings, someone's clothes was stored in this chest of drawers, that person would die. Usually a pretty not nice death. And if a baby's clothes were put in there, that baby tended to die as a young child or in infancy. One of the last deaths associated with it was a man named Herbert Moore Jr. He put his hunting clothes in the chest, and then he was killed in a gun accident at the home of his neighbors. And that happened on April 5th, 1946. Now, sometime in the late 1940s, Virginia Cleveland and one of her maids decided they were going to try to break the curse, and to this day, some of the owl feathers they used in the ritual are still in the one of the drawers of the chest, trying to keep the curse at bay. But no one will store any clothes in it to this day, so we don't know if the curse was really broken or not. Just a little interesting tidbit of cursed furniture history, I guess. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the stories. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe if you want to, leave me a comment down below. And as always, thanks for listening. Music by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio.